We are made for communion with the real. And we're born into it, and that should be the philosophical paradigm. That should be the philosophical paradigm. Why should it be Descartes? Why should it be knowledge is power? Actually, if you exalt knowledge as power, the knowledge goes away and it becomes all about power, which is what we've got. And we've got a world, an environment that's getting raped because we're not in communion with it.
Hi, I'm Glen from Speak Life. We like to see all things through the lens of Jesus, including the subject of epistemology. What is epistemology? Well, I'm glad you asked because we have a world expert in that field, and she will tell us what is epistemology and why it matters today. Her name is Esther Lightcap Meek, and she joins me on the line. Hello, Esther.
Hi, it's so good to see you and be with you. Thank you for having me on.
How would you describe who you are and what you do to our audience?
Well, I'm a very odd philosopher. Some people have said I'm the merriest philosopher they know. But I especially like to do philosophy that's for us all, because I think we're all philosophical, which involves writing in such a way that it's for everybody too. So does that get at what you think? What do you think I am? I'm trained as a philosopher, taught as a philosopher, but I've got this conviction I've got to write for all of us. So I write philosophy books that I try to make accessible to everybody.
You say all of us are philosophers. It's kind of started for you at an early age. You're a thoughtful girl growing up. What were the sort of questions that gripped you early on?
Well, they gripped me when I was about 13. And I had grown up in a Bible-believing family, and still am. And I thought I knew all there was to know about God, but I had questions about knowing. So, I had a question, how do I know that God exists? And then I had this other question, which was, how do I know that anything exists outside my mind? So I was, do you know the old movie, The Matrix?
Sure, right.
That kind of.
I'm from the 1900s. I remember that.
Yeah, right. So, I didn't tell anybody about those questions. I thought they were sin and too weird to let people know. But I felt like those were the most important things to have proof for, and I had no proof. So I was later, when I was in high school, that I read some of the work of Francis Schaeffer and realized that my questions weren't sin, they were philosophical, and that responses to them had shaped whole cultural epochs across the disciplines, which fired my imagination for the humanities and interdisciplinary studies. I still didn't know you could study philosophy. When I found that out, it took me 12 hours to change my life and go after studying philosophy, because I felt like, even though I was sure I wasn't smart enough, it was the most important thing, and I was morally obligated. So I have never looked back from that moment. And, when you look at my the trajectory of my writing over the last, it's been 21 years since the publication of the first of some books, I was on a mission to respond to those two questions. So the first book addresses whether we can know God. And then the others developed my approach to knowing, which I've been able to work out and find a really healing approach. And then having responsibly addressed my epistemological questions, now, I've been able in recent years to connect with reality, which has been my lifelong quest, and do some things with regard to that.
So you've just described really a lot of what epistemology is about. Can I know the external world? Can I connect with reality? Can I connect with God? How do I know what I know? Is that what epistemology is? What is epistemology, and why should people care about it?
Yeah, well, it's about so philosophy addresses like these most fundamental matters in our lives. One is knowing, one is reality, one is who we are as human persons, and one is what is right and good. And so you can consider the matter of God philosophically too, and that would permeate all of them. Well, they have these big long names, and epistemology is the name of study of knowledge, just from Greek. It's a Greek word. But how it is that we know whatever it is that we know, how does knowing work, that sort of thing. One of the things I think we may not realize is knowing is like a thread in a tapestry of our lives. I mean, it's through everything that we do. We're always involved in knowing. We're always involved with reality. We're always involved with action. We're always acting out our humanness. So that's kind of why I felt morally obligated to study philosophy, because you can't not. You know, you are enacting it with every step that you take. So one philosopher quips that it's like somebody who woke up one morning and realized he'd been speaking prose all of his life. You know, philosophy's like that. You are a philosophical being as a human person. And that's, again, why I think we need to have philosophical help and delight, just as whoever we are as human persons. A dog is not philosophical. So, I mean, he doesn't look in the mirror in the morning and say, "Who am I?" Whereas we human persons do that all the time. And we do ask questions about knowing and about reality and what is right and good, you know, and God and all those kinds of things. So I try to access that. I've come up with some cool ideas, I think, over the years that I think are really healing in this response. So it's not like I'm an expert on all the philosophers in the world and all the epistemologies in the world and all of that. I don't think of myself that way. But in God's kindness, I've found responses to my own questions, which were desperate, and now that I share with others.
You said in your story that having those questions about, do I know God and how do I know that I know God, and what about the external world, you felt they might be sin. Is there a problem in the church? Is there a problem in the Western church where we fear opening up those sorts of questions? If so, where does that come from?
I felt in my conservative evangelical tradition, rightly, that the Bible is the authority about God. And so what I was told was, to know God, you believe the Bible. To me, that begged larger other questions. And in particular, how does knowing work at all? So, and I did not feel that I was in and I'm sure of this, I was not in a community that I felt welcomed those questions. That was one thing that was unique about Francis Schaeffer, was that he did. And he taught some of us that you needed to be open to inquiry about those kinds of questions and deal with them in a respectful way with regard to people that were raising them, that were often young people like me at the time. So, and I do, but I look back on the people I knew then, and I look currently at the people I know in lots of inside of conservative churches and throughout culture who have no idea of the philosophical. And that's part of our defective philosophical heritage in the modern West. The modern West and the ideas, the philosophical ideas that define it, are anti-philosophical. So if you exalt the pragmatic and utility, and you exalt information, as we do, philosophy sounds useless, and we don't talk about our being philosophical beings. And so to the extent that it's in the church because it's in the culture. And you'd think the church would be wiser about that, but, not necessarily. So that's why when I start talking to people, the first thing I do is try to, pin them up against the wall and say, look, you're a philosophical being, and you have been deprived of your philosophical birthright by the modern West, because you've been taught that what you need to do is be a nuts and bolts pragmatic sort of a person, and that philosophy is useless. So now, on the other hand, I've got to say a lot of philosophy is useless because, in a different sense of the word, in that I don't think it's made accessible as if this is for all of us, right? So I think that's really important. That's certainly, I went into philosophy because of my questions, and that's what I've needed to work out.
So everyone's a philosopher. Even those who say that philosophy is superseded by scientific questions and pragmatic questions and getting things done, you would say they have a philosophy.
Which is a philosophical statement. That's a philosophical statement, right?
Yes.
So
that they haven't interrogated or
right.
Yeah, or studied, yeah.
You can't say that science is all there is by doing a lab experiment. You just can't. There's got to be more.
Yeah, to say that the only kind of truth is scientific truth is not itself a scientific statement. If that statement is true, then it's false, because it is a statement that is not itself scientific, and yet you're saying that it's true. And yet there are lots of people nowadays who make those sorts of claims. You might think of something like the new atheism, which does seem like a kind of a repackaged logical positivism from 100 years ago, in which you get people very anti-philosophical. And what's the genealogy of ideas in that? Is it simply that, well, science has proved such a very useful kind of mode in which to view the world, and therefore we kind of get the idea that because science is great, therefore it supersedes and pushes out everything else? What else is going on in why we've become such pragmatists?
Well, I'm not the expert on this area that I should be, but that's what I write, and that is when you look back to the inventors of modernity, the masters, quote unquote, we might use with kind of a double meaning. Descartes, known as the father of modern philosophy. We still laud Francis Bacon, knowledge is power. There was that's the 1600s, and there was a really push to jettison philosophy to exalt power and being, as Descartes said, masters and possessors of nature, which means you've got to, if you're going to abuse something, you need to dehumanize it first. Just like in the, the genocides, you've got to belittle nature if you're going to rape it, to use Galileo's word, right? So there really was a rejection of philosophy, in particular metaphysics, and this is the area where I'm a novice, there's other people I can refer you to do this, but it's, science has proved its authority because that was the philosophical proposal that began it in modernity. I mean, that's not what science was before. Now, pragmatically, that's obviously there's lots of value that comes out of things that we've discovered, but it came at a price, and it need not be that way. I would argue science would be better if we hadn't done dumb things philosophically, including epistemologically.
Even the title for, what you would call a scientist kind of before the 16th century, you would call them a natural philosopher, a philosopher of the natural world. Interestingly, isn't it, that you translate that into scientia, which just means knowledge. And now science is just equivalent to knowledge, apparently, and not this subspecies
right.
of philosophy more generally, and a love of, you can have a love of wisdom that studies the natural world. What a healthier place in which to do science than to simply think that, science equals knowledge.
Right. That's right. I mean, one word you dropped in there was love. You were saying love of wisdom. But science, if you've got a great scientist, that is ought to be a trajectory of love and delight, right? Which are more fundamental philosophical things. I've said to my students, you want to study with a scientist with a twinkle in their eye, and the twinkle gets there not only for the student but also for the thing that they're ecstatic about, and now we're starting to get into how knowing works, So part of what goes on, Glen, I think, is that we human persons kind of have some default ways that we go about knowing that are human. It's just that in modernity, we have been taught to misdescribe what we're doing. And so one of the things that I see my work as kind of a philosophical therapy, an epistemological therapy, to relay the accents so people can can see what they're actually doing when they know. And then that changes the ball game as far as what the ideal is, like the paradigm of great knowing. And when you get that healed, that makes far richer, more wonderful sense of science, of business, of counseling, of lots of things like that make it better than what the defective misimpression does. So you probably know Michael Polanyi, this scientist turned philosopher that I did my philosophical work in, and whose ideas about knowing I incorporate into my own. And he said, and he was a premier scientist, Hungarian, came to England, to Manchester, to save his life, from in the early 1930s. But he said, if the paradigm of knowing in modernity is correct, no scientific discovery could ever happen. But it does. That's some fixture epistemology. So in other words, he was trying to save science.
Yes.
By saying, look, this is how we actually go about knowing.
I'd love to dig into that. So if you're doing therapy on us, there must be a kind of there's a disease that needs healing for us. The disease is, what is the disease? Is the disease that we think that we come to know by being these objective external observers who just calmly and coolly collate the data and just get more and more information, and that's how we come to know? Is that sort of at the heart of the problem?
Yes, yeah, and I call it therapy because we body forth these presumptions implicitly. And so we somehow, it's kind of in the water or in the air. I love multiple metaphors of modernity. That's what makes us moderns, that we presume that knowledge is what you just said. But we're, we don't address that. We don't focus on that, but we just presume it. And it's almost like it's part of our what we embody. And so if you're going to fix a way of seeing the world that's bodied, you need to do something. You need to honor bodied knowledge, and then you need to address it in a way that is more like therapy than it would be argumentation. Now, arguments are great tools, but the change needs to come in the way that we body forth our knowing.
So we don't come to know by being neutral observers who are outside the system. How do we come to know things?
Well, here's the Michael Polanyi line. Okay. All knowing has a two-level structure, from to. So we rely on clues to scrabble toward and integrate to a pattern that we then submit to as a token of reality. So if that's how knowing happens, and you just need to stop and think of the word clue. You've got to accredit, and this was Polanyi's big argument in his magnum opus, things that you can't put into words, half understandings, and you have to rely on them, which means you have to, you're involved in trust of what you half understand as you grope toward a half-hidden pattern. And then when the breakthrough of insight comes, you may have actively shaped it, but then you also have this sense of submitting to something that's come from beyond you that then opens up doorways of possibilities to the future. So that's what coming to know looks like. So how would a discovery come about? And he says in one of his books, the paradigm example of knowing is knowledge of an approaching discovery. It's not explicit information. If he had spent his time with explicit information, he would not have been the discoverer that he was, right? But you have to have some kind of sense of a half-hidden, glimmering, inviting pattern that woos you and pulls you toward it. And so, and then you've got this from-to thing going on. So you have your eye on that, and then you start scrabbling toward it, you know, relying on clues and putting things together, da-da-da, da-da-da, da-da-da. That is all, his word was subsidiary, which means that you have to get inside of it with your focus on the pattern. Indwelling was another word that he used. But you grope toward it and you welcome it to come. And then what happens is when it comes, when the pattern comes, it transforms everything in retrospect that you were groping toward. So when is a clue no longer a clue, but a part of the whole? It's when you solve the mystery. But at that point, you don't need it anymore as a clue, right? So in advance of it, you've got this half-understanding stuff going on. And then when you achieve the pattern, oh, well, so-and-so did it, or whatever, then all the things that you were groping through and indwelling become parts in the whole. And so there's a primacy to that whole, to that integrative pattern that is actually irreducible to all the things you were groping by means of toward it.
What you're describing there, and what Polanyi's describing there, seems to be like reality is not simply inert.
Right.
It seems to be calling to us or something. Is it appropriate to use those sorts of words?
Well, I think so. So I feel as if I did my time studying Polanyi. And did I mention that my second question was, how do I know there's a reality outside my mind? So one of the things that Polanyi said, and this is what I did my dissertation on because this was like the water of life to me. Polanyi, the discoverer, would say, oh, by the way, you know you've made contact with reality when you have a sense of the possibility of indeterminate future manifestations, which means a sense of future prospects, hints, more possibilities than you can name. So it's not confirmation so much as hope of confirmation, which actually, I think that makes sense of a whole swaths of our lives. But to me, when I tried to, so that gave me a hope of reality. It's like until in the last 10 years, I had never read anybody else that used the phrase contact with reality. And that was what I needed. That was what I longed for because I felt like I didn't have it, right? And so here's this happy assurance. But then what he crafts it as is this sense of this inexhaustive range of future possibilities, things you cannot name, but it's just full and brimming with future possibilities. Well, over the years, it has come to me, it has come to seem to me that reality's there first, and reality is wooing me, right? And when it shows up, it kind of walks in and takes over. Right. I tell a story in Longing to Know, my first book, about seeing a copperhead snake, which is a poisonous snake you don't want to be near. and looking down and finding it at my feet. And my reality completely shifted at that point when I picked out the pattern and saw the copperhead. Right? So that's how I know it was real. I was running. So that's our common experience.
Yeah. So a person who doesn't believe in an external reality, I guess you call him a solipsist. Have you met any solipsists in real life? And even if you haven't, like what would you say to such a person? Because it's often said that you simply cannot convince somebody about the reality of the external world. You take it on faith and away you go. Is that the sort of thing you say, or how would you interact with such a person?
Well, that's a wonderful question. I feel as if you look at Descartes' thought experiment that led to him saying, "I think, therefore I am," it's kind of crafted as a solipsism, which is, a certitude of one's own own existence as over against even one's own body. So, there's a fundamental loneliness to the modern outlook, and a fundamental rejection of external reality. So it's the case that my odd questions were spawned in modernity, right? So there is a not particularly naturalness about those questions, and so that's changed for me. But I also have to say, Glenn, that I feel as if my questions were a kind of solipsism. And there are people who share odd questions like that. And I actually, in recent years, have found some kind of a response to that. And I'm writing it in my next book, which is developing an idea I've gotten from other philosophers about the philosophical formation that we all receive in the welcoming smile of mothers when we're infants, and obviously family also, and friends. So that book is going to be called, maybe, Being Seen. So what the baby drops into is the rapturous gaze of the loving mother, and is formed philosophically in the most fundamental way in that, which means then that the fundamental paradigm, and this is a philosophical matter, but the fundamental existential experience is not me in here, world out there, but me in communion with in a welcome that was looking for me. And it's encounter, it's face to face, it's intimate, it's rapturous, and it's epiphanic, meaning it's an epiphany. Reality shows up and says, "Here you are, I've been looking for you." And then what happens also in that is I see myself being seen. And there's a philosophical magic about that. I think the friends continue this philosophical formation through your life. So a kind of noticing regard is essential to my sense of my being here. So I can work out some of those things in response to somebody who's not sure that anything exists outside their mind.
That's very interesting, taking us back to the experience of an infant in the arms of our mother, because the starting point then for the human person is one of dependence, is one of receiving from the outside, whereas if you start with Descartes in the oven as a thinker, right? If you start with Rodin's thinker, there he is, contemplating things. If you start with Vitruvian Man as you're starting with somebody standing on their own 2 feet, already full to some degree. Whereas if you just pay attention to what human beings are actually like, we start off as empty and requiring a greater reality from outside us the entire time. And so, no wonder a West that is very full of itself and very full of our own self-sufficiency becomes solipsistic in that way.
Well, I think, too, it might be helpful to see that it's not 100% receptive. What it is communion.
Yeah.
And that's what human persons are made for. We are made for communion with the real. And we're born into it. And that should be the philosophical paradigm. That should be the philosophical paradigm. Why should it be Descartes? Why should it be knowledge as power? Actually, if you exalt knowledge as power, the knowledge goes away and it becomes all about power, which is what we've got. And we've got a world, an environment that's getting raped because we're not in communion with it. I mean, we have got to fix not only our account of knowing, but our regard for things. We've got to return to the regard for the other that we learn in communion with the mother and with friends. We've got to return to that.
So Polanyi himself was not a believer. There are other kind of people in the realms of epistemology who, for instance, from a Roman Catholic point of view, I think there's one way of casting Descartes as the baddie. There's another way of casting Martin Luther as the baddie.
Yeah.
In terms of here is, here I stand, I can do no other, and you can take certain statements of that, and my conscience is captive, and he stands, to go against conscience is not safe. Is that, in one sense, part of the beginning of the inward turn towards the self, and not to receive what Mother Church has been saying? For instance, this is what my Roman Catholic kind of friends would say. What would you say to that?
Well, first of all, I would not want to weigh in on I would not say that Polanyi was not a believer. I would say he didn't write religious works.
Right.
I think he was incredibly attuned and right in this respect, that he understood that his ideas were needed by current Christianity, and he was right about that. And then I would say, I too see that my Catholic friends actually lay the blame for Descartes at the door of Protestantism, because it was they say Descartes got the ideas. I'm thinking of Fergus Kerr here, who wrote this. But then they also, and I would agree with this, lay some blame at the feet of William of Ockham, who was a theologian, philosopher in the 1300s, right after Thomas Aquinas. And he had a very, his agenda was so to exalt the absolute power of God that it really denuded creative reality. Because, I mean, he said, I can't rely on my perception because God could give me any perception he wanted. Oh!
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so, you can trace Luther's scholarly heritage to William of Ockham. So there's that. But that's not my area of expertise. And what I have found is in recent years, I have for the first time been more exposed to philosophy, good philosophy in contemporary versions of medieval Christian tradition, which I think are wonderful and useful. And a lot of that's coming into my work. But I don't feel that it's exclusive to the Roman tradition.
Yeah. I mean, as you were describing some of Polanyi's work, I was thinking about faith-seeking understanding as sort of Anselm's understanding of how knowledge works, sort of pulling at the thread, but, beginning with some presuppositions as well, and going on that journey outward seems to be a very faith-seeking understanding kind of a thing.
Yeah, Polanyi loved the Augustinian primacy of faith thing. But here's how it comes to expression in Polanyi's work and in my own. Let's talk about riding a bike. You've got to rely on that bike. You've got to rely, in my case, the authoritative word of my father, who was yelling, balance. I couldn't even make sense of that, I was a baby skeptic, right? But somehow I had to climb into what he was saying. I had to override my severe sense that I could not trust that bike to get on it, right? And so when you then fast forward to anybody, keeping their balance on a bike and riding it, that's a tissue of trust. You trust words, you trust the bike, and you've got this palpable sense. It's called keeping your balance, and so Polanyi defined commitment as a certain manner of disposing ourselves toward reality. Well, that's what I'm doing with that bike. So knowing involves faith, right? Because it's you've got to redefine, re-see what is going on in knowing to see that it's fraught with trust. It's fraught with pledge. That's why I call it covenant epistemology. You pledge yourself to the reality that you do not yet know to start to live life on its terms for it ever to be gracious enough to condescend to disclose itself to you. And you can hear some of the intimate reciprocity in my language there, which is fully intentional on my part. Yeah.
How does that help people in a modern secular age in which people don't feel like they've even begun to have the muscles to flex when it comes to faith? There are plenty of people, I think, and speaking in a UK context, there are plenty of people who recognize that the secular story has run out, that we're probably not the kind of the brains on sticks that we had imagined ourselves to be, but they can't just believe the Christian mumbo jumbo, right? They've read Tom Holland's Dominion, and they recognize that we've come from a Christian heritage. They look wistfully, perhaps, across at Christians like you or I, and they wish they could believe, but they're just not that kind of a people. They're secular people. They're rational people. Like, what do you say to such people?
Well, first of all, you have to fix your subpar idea of rationality, right? And see what you're actually doing when you are engaged in rational behavior. I feel like, Glenn, what you're raising is just the issue that I addressed in Longing to Know. And my experience, I had those questions, and what was started to be the solution for me is Michael Polanyi's alternative, where he said, look, what you think is scientific method is not how you know. Here's how knowing works. Here's what you're actually doing when you know. And when he points it out, you can't help but say, that is what I'm doing when I know, right? And then you get that fixed. And for me, what I found was when I read Polanyi's work, I thought, well, this makes sense of my Christianity. And what I needed to see was that my Christian belief was not some weird thing called faith, as opposed to the binary of reason, which is a bill of goods that modernity has sold us, But you've got to revamp what you think goes on in reason, which is knowing, so you see that there isn't a binary. But you need a positive alternative, and that's what Polanyi gave me. So you see, if you've got the binary and you want to reject faith, then you've got just reason. If reason now just seems like this talking head on a stick, as you referenced, and you want to go back to faith, the only way what you have to do is get rid of the binary. Because you can't just like salt in a bit of faith with your reason. The whole thing needs fixed. And it's not just faith and reason. It's, facts and values. It's public and private. It's objective and subject. I've got I call them Esther's daisy of dichotomies at the beginning of Loving to Know. The whole thing needs to be revamped. And the one way I know to revamp it for somebody is to teach them Polanyi's subsidiary focal integration. That's the only way. And then what happens is the whole modernist defective presumption is dispelled. Not just bike riding. I love baseball. There is no way you could be an outfielder or a third baseman or a pitcher on the defective modernist understanding of knowledge.
Okay, why?
You would be paralyzed. You wouldn't... Well, because you can't play that way. It's not... Okay, baseball loves statistics, but it's not a collection of information. It is this beautiful skill of artistry. And all knowing is skilled knowing. It's all artful knowing. And, you want to see beauty and wisdom. I mean, look at a 35-year-old pitcher. That's closer to how knowing works. And that's what we humans are good at.
Right.
Am I responding to what you asked?
In some of my evangelism, what I try to do is, show people the dichotomy that they've lived with, that it doesn't work. And so with the fact-value division, for instance, I'll go into university campuses and we'll talk about human rights, and we'll so on what basis is there an inviolable worth and dignity to all human beings? And very quickly people realize, there's not an equation that gives me this. There's not a scientific, experiment done under laboratory conditions that gives me this thing. I look into the face of somebody who is not economically valuable, and I think of them as having this inviolable worth and dignity, and I value. I simply see in them a value that goes beyond anything that can be justified economically or via their strength or abilities. And then I get people to think to themselves, well, like in your mind's eye, think of somebody who is not economically valuable, and imagine in your mind's eye that person as being in the image of God. And I'll put in the image of God with a little I. Now can I take you in your mind's eye to see a man on a cross and a Roman spear shoved up into his side, and the Roman thought that this was a good picture of what glory looks like, because here is domination. But for 2,000 years, Christians have been looking at that image and thinking, no, this is a great image of glory, because here is somebody who is not economically valuable, not valuable in any way, shape, or form to anybody, except that he's dying for the world. And Christians believe that person is the image of God with a capital I. And what I want the person to do is to recognize, if you have compassion on the weak and the poor and the marginalized, you're already exercising that thing that Christians are doing. And we just invite you to see that in the echo of the image with a capital I, you are looking on images with a little I, and that is the original. And as soon as you see the original and you say, yes, that's the original, you're basically saying Jesus is Lord. I try to take them on that journey. Is that anything like what you're describing?
That's not. That's lovely, by the way. It's beautiful. I typically write to people that are. Well, I talk about knowing. I stay. I don't see myself as doing theology, per se, and my job is fixing people's idea of knowing. So that's not typically a conversation I would pursue, but that's fine. That's fine. But what I want to say is, look, you can't do science without value. You whatever, like when you get down to the paradigm of knowing, of all human knowing, it involves value. You have to assign value to the clues, or you never see the copperhead. You just don't. So it is value driven. And when I say value there, I don't mean just morals. I mean color, pattern. For you to pick out a copperhead, you got to decide on what's foreground and what's marginal, right? Or the pattern would never come. Well, that's value, right? So we navigate by value, and that's about rationality. So that's kind of my...
Is there a journey that you can take someone on in order to say, okay, this is how you come to know things. Therefore, reality is very person-like, wouldn't you say? Therefore, all people are believers, wouldn't you say? Therefore, covenant is incredibly... it's kind of prior to you and your own individual, identity. Kind of makes you think that we live in a covenant, in a covenantal reality. Ergo, God. Is there that kind of journey that you ever take people on?
Yeah, I'm pretty explicit that I'm going to just presume that Scripture is an authoritative word of God, and so. But that's an epistemological claim, but it's not one that I'm gonna. I don't see my role as defending that. Other people have done that very well. My what I do is contribute some ideas on knowing that I think go with that. But the account of knowing that I developed following Polanyi's subsidiary focal integration and developing it, I augment it to. I say that the paradigm of best acts of knowing is the interpersonal covenantally constituted relationship best typified in the redemptive encounter, where reality walks in and transforms you. That approach to knowing, I think, I argue this in Loving to Know, means that all acts of knowing bear witness to a person-like reality that is coming after you. And so you might say they bear apologetic witness of there being a person beyond. Right? I mean, it seems pretty... I think it's pretty glaring. If you're a Christian believer, you're totally down with this. But the fact is, anybody who has some kind of moment of insight... they're liable to call it an inspiration, meaning
Right.
They do have a sense of wonder that something has come from beyond, or someone. They all do.
Yeah. And there's beautiful YouTube videos you can find of scientists coming up with, making breakthroughs in theories, and their eureka moment just brings them to tears, and it's a religious moment, isn't it?
It becomes an act of worship. But it begs the larger question, well, what is reality?
Yeah.
And I think reality is God and his stuff, meaning the stuff he created. But that means the stuff that he created kind of, I liken it to walking into, I was going to spend the night with a former student who invited me to do that, and she didn't get home before I arrived, and I walked into her home, and it was so full of her character in all the way she had arranged it, right? So that's why I feel like
right.
This world, I've walked into a world that's full of the signature knickknacks of a really huge personal being. And they're all just kind of bearing witness, and I feel like knowing does that. I do feel that knowing does that.
Yeah. And the more you know your friend, the more you look at the knickknacks and think, oh, I know exactly why she bought that knickknack or that knickknack. In the same way, if we're going to know this world, get to know the God who made it. Yeah.
This young woman was the daughter of diplomats and actually still is in foreign service around the world. And her room was full, her house was full of stuff from the world. It was, pretty neat.
Yeah, we're all living in God's house. Esther, you've been so kind and so generous with your time. For people to really get a hold of this stuff, what should they read next? What can they watch, or can they connect with you online?
Thank you so much for asking that. I have a website, estherlightcapmeek.com, and on the website, you can find out about the books that I've written and what they're, what the point of them is. And then you can also find other resources. So I have this, I call it a passive podcast page because I don't run a podcast like you do, but I get invited like I am now onto that. And then if you'll share your link with me, then eventually it'll end up on my passive podcast. So that's called Watch, Listen, and Read. And so if there's things that get done like this, I like to post them there. So there's some resources to read around, and you can reach me through that. You can subscribe to my monthly updates there. So I think that's a good place to start and figure out what you're going to read and go for it.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
And you are a very merry philosopher and wonderful to engage with, a joy to engage with. So yeah, I heartily recommend that. Esther Lightcap Meek, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Glen. Great to know you.